Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Welcome to part 2 of our 4-part series, The Greatest Hits of Garden Basics with Farmer Fred of 2022, and this is part 2. The 4 parts include the top 10 most listened to segments that ran last year. In part 1, last week, we talked about tomatoes, and that included choosing the easiest to grow varieties, pruning tomato flowers, the best tomatoes for containers, and battling diseases. And one in particular, blossom end rot. If you're a backyard tomato grower, go back and listen to episode 248 for lots of great tips on growing tomatoes. This time around, we're talking with Emily Murphy. She's the author of the book Grow Now, and she'll be explaining how keeping your soil undisturbed as much as possible can be applied to your raised beds and container plants. And this goes way beyond no-till gardening. She calls it no-dig gardening, and she talks about a way to build up your soil without having to purchase bags or yards of potting mix. She calls it lasagna gardening. But first, we present the most listened to segment in the Garden Basics podcast last year. In fact, it's the all-time leader in listenership as we enter our 4th year of production. It's all about growing berries. We talk with Master Gardener and accomplished home blackberry, boysenberry, and raspberry grower Pam Bone. She has lots of good tips for growing these tasty, healthy treats. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go. We're at the house of Master Gardener Pam Bone here in Sacramento County, and she loves raspberries, and you ought to see her raspberry garden. So today we're going to talk some raspberry basics. And Pam, this is a rather phenomenal stretch of raspberries you have here. It looks to be about 25 feet long and about 8 feet deep. But what I like is that you have incorporated rows between the raspberries so that you never have to reach more than 2.5 feet to pick the berry. So that was smart thinking of putting the rows that you can walk on to be able to reach.
That is really critical. Actually, it's really difficult. Otherwise, you don't get into the middle to harvest. It's hard for pruning later on. It's hard for pest control. It's really important. So what we did is we have some raised beds. They originally were 2x6s. They've sort of disintegrated over the years, but the soil has built up, and then between those raised beds, then we put down a lot of mulch. And over the years, it's raised up as well. And so what we have is pathways throughout the whole area, and you can reach and pick and harvest, and it's really easy to get to it, and it makes it a lot easier than a big solid block, and that is really important.
How adaptable are raspberries to the United States? Are there zone limitations?
Well, some people would tell you that they can't grow raspberries in Sacramento, that they have a really horrible time. And we've been growing raspberries here at our house for practically the whole time we've lived here, which is nearly 42 years. And there are certain varieties for certain locations. So you have to know what will do well here. You also have to know kind of location they require too. How much sun can they take? You know, you have to have sun in order to produce the berry itself. But here in our area, we have been planting Heritage and Oregon 1030, and those are varieties that are adapted to the heat. And the Heritage variety is still available everywhere. My daughter grows Heritage in Washington, in Pullman, Washington. So these are what we call the fall bearers or ever bearers, and they are a little bit different variety than the kind that you put up on a trellis and all, which actually they're much easier to prune and that. So yes, just go to your local cooperative extension or your nursery and find out what varieties are adapted to your area and what are their growth habit, and do you want that kind of growth habit? How much work are you willing to do with training them and pruning them and everything? So we've adapted very well here and produce huge crops of berries.
If you look at the picture that's with today's episode of Pam's raspberry bed, you see a lot of T-posts sticking up with a lot of wires. And judging by the heights of the wires, it looks like these raspberries get maybe 6 feet tall.
Oh, yes, definitely. They will grow at least that far. And then, in fact, sort of hang over. So I'd say they might even be 7 feet tall. They grow beautifully in our area, in the location that we have, and very vigorously. And we found that this system maintains them without having to do a huge trellis system, because what these are, they are pruned down, not to the ground, but to basically brown sticks in the winter months. And then the new spring growth comes up, and then it keeps growing, and then new growth comes up from the base to produce a fall crop. What we found is that it's almost like creating a little playpen for them. All you really need are wires that go around just to hold the berries inside so that they'll remain upright. So all we do here is you just come on over here, Fred, and you just move the berries as they grow into the wires, and then they're just held inside. And so we've got a center wire here too, so they won't flop. And it's a really ideal system. We found it works really, really well for this type of everbearer or fallbearer raspberry.
What's the spacing on these plants?
Well, what was the spacing on the plant?
Originally, and what is it now?
Yeah, right. Right now, they're probably, my husband just went and we harvest a lot of plants that come up in between the rows, and we have another little nursery area that's too much shade for very much berry production. So we then harvest and we place plants that die out. And I would say they're probably about maybe a foot apart or so. They probably started out back in the day about 2 feet apart, but no, this is a block system. It's okay for them to be a little bit crowded, but you can see there's some areas that are a little bit more open, and other areas that it's a little bit more compact and that. So I don't think you can really mess up with this system at all, and they can be fairly close together. Remember, raspberries send up nice little new plants all over the place, and so if you space them far apart, they're going to fill in on their own anyhow. So you don't have to crowd them when you first start.
This is being irrigated by a drip irrigation system.
Yes.
You have lines of 1/4-inch tubing. It looks like the emitters are spaced at 8 or 12 inches apart. And the lines themselves are maybe a foot apart each to ensure equal soaking of the soil. Are raspberries a thirsty plant?
They are. They do need even watering, regular watering. And we did find out kind of the hard way. We've always used a drip irrigation system, but back in the old day, before they had pressure compensating inline emitters, we had this laser tubing, and it just really produced a lot of water. And we wanted to be more efficient. And so even though it was on a drip system, we wanted to change to these new lines. And we found out we've got to put a lot more of these in here because these plants are thirstier than we thought, and that laser tubing was putting out a lot more water. Luckily, it puts that out very efficiently, but yes, I would say we do water these once a week, but when we do, they may have to run for 4 to 6 hours at a time, depending on the heat and how hot it gets in the summertime here, or what kind of a hot spell we're having, or whatever. We may then turn it on twice a week, but not run it quite as long. So I adjust it. But right now it's set for once a week, and I believe it's on for 4 hours.
All right. It's springtime when we're recording this, so those would be spring hours of irrigation.
Exactly. Right. And we increase it. What we want to do is increase the amount of water that is put on at any one time, so we're not doing any shallow irrigation. These roots are not extremely deep at all, not like a fruit tree or anything, but you do want to wet the soil down at least a foot to 18 inches and keep it moist. And we mulch. Everything is mulched, and a lot of compost over the top as a top dressing to save water, to keep the water into the soil. Try to be as energy and water efficient as we possibly can. But berries, I will say, just like any fruit crop in your landscape, if you really have to save water because you're in a drought or whatever, then get rid of your lawn, because you can't get rid of your fruit trees. And unfortunately, fruit trees, berries, and other things like that take just about as much water as a lawn, if not more. But look at what you're getting out of it.
You can eat the berries. It's kind of hard to eat grass.
That's exactly right. So we just keep reducing the lawn if we feel like we need to save water.
With all the compost and mulch you're using, what sort of fertilizer regimen do you need for raspberries?
Well, actually, we don't have to do much of anything, but once a year in the spring, we do over top dress with usually something high in nitrogen. Just like all fruits of all sorts, and we grow a lot of fruits in our landscape, they need nitrogen to grow and to produce fruit. People think, oh, you need phosphorus and potassium, but we've done a lot of soil testing in our area, and I worked for the Cooperative Extension for many years and saw a lot of soil tests come by, and for the most part, we don't see a lot of phosphorus and potassium deficiencies in our woody plants and our fruit trees. Our berries, they might need a little bit more because they don't have as extensive as a root system. So what I usually generally do is just buy something that is an all-purpose, higher in nitrogen fertilizer. As long as it doesn't have any kind of a weed killer in it, lawn fertilizer works just as well.
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of good, starter lawn fertilizers that take their time to break down and can feed the plants for a much longer period of time. And actually, lawn fertilizers are a fairly good choice for a lot of massive plantings like raspberries here. And also, like you say, as long as you avoid the weed and feed products and just stick with the feed products, you're okay.
That's true. And actually, this year we did put on a lawn fertilizer. We went out and purchased, we needed some more for the lawn itself. And so I thought, well, let me look for one that is high in nitrogen, but has a little phosphorus and potassium and a little P and K in there. And that'll be good for the berry plants. We also, in addition, grow boysenberries as well. And so I needed something that we could do for those as well. And then we can just use the same old thing on our citrus and our apple tree and everything else. One fertilizer makes it a lot easier.
Raspberries, harvest time is when, and how do you harvest them, and how long can you store them?
Well, the berries, this particular variety, now remember, these are the two-crop variety, and a lot of people may grow raspberries that only produce a spring crop. This one also produces the fall crop.
It's heritage, right?
Heritage is the one that you can find in the nurseries now, and it's pretty much everywhere. I think they sell it all over the United States. That particular variety then will start bearing a crop in late May, early June, and we'll get a pretty good crop then. In fact, actually, it might even be mid-May this year. It looks like some of the flowers are getting pretty well developed already at the ends. Now, this is a flower fruiting cycle where these are the old canes from last year that were cut down, and then the new growth that you see here is all from last year. As soon as these bear here in about another month and a half or so, then they are going to die back. And then all the new canes arising from below that are going to come up, they're going to produce then a fall crop. And I will say that it's kind of unpredictable, but most of the time our, quote, fall crop, and I should say fall with quotes around it because really the crop starts in August. Oh. And it'll go till Thanksgiving easily in our area, unless we get a really cold snap.
So when that stem has produced berries, that stem should be removed?
We usually wait until it starts to look really dead and looks like it's not productive at all. And then we, cut it out. And the reason is we used to just leave them, but we found out that we had that mite problem when we had a little bit of drought stress. And we found that if it's too crowded, you don't get the air circulation, the leaves get dusty and dry, and mites love that. And we just found that it was easier just to remove it, open it up, and get rid of it. And then it left a lot of opportunity for the rest of the canes to come up and grow. And then those come up, then they fruit, and we get a great crop. I say the heaviest crop is mid-August to the end of September, a great crop. And I put up a lot of jam. So my husband has to pick. He does all the picking. I do all the putting up. My husband calls himself the gardener. I'm the horticulturist. We used to work together on a lot of this stuff, but now he's got me in the kitchen, putting all this stuff up. He then will harvest about every 5 days, because if you don't, two things will happen. The fruit will get soft and mushy, and then it'll stop producing. But the soft and mushy attracts a fruit fly that goes to our cherry trees as well here. And we haven't had a real problem the last few years if you're really careful with keeping it up. But sometimes if you let that particular fruit fly go wild here, it will infest the fruit with unknown little white maggots until you're making your jam, and all of a sudden there they are. So, and especially the fall crops. So we have to be really careful and really religious about getting rid of any fruit that's too soft or decayed or whatever. And
picking the raspberries, can you pluck them or do you have to cut them?
No, in these, you just pull right off. They pull off very easily, and not a problem at all. And in fact, when we get down to the boysenberries, same thing. You can just pull them right off. You don't have to cut anything. They're very easy to pick. They're not too, they're a little bit thorny, but, a little bit of prickles on them, but not too bad.
What does Mike the gardener use to store the raspberries as he's picking them? Does he have a big bag, or is he just carrying a bucket?
So what I do is I like them because to be in a colander. And so I have a lot of large metal colanders and some plastic colanders. That way there's more broad surface area. He brings them into the house then, and I kind of make sure that they are well distributed because I put them in the refrigerator. And actually, raspberries have a very, very long refrigerator life. They can easily stay in a refrigerator without having to put them up to do anything with them for 5 to 7 days and not see any decay or anything, as long as you've picked them without already having a problem with a soft fruit. I try to get to them, though, and put them up if I can within about 2 to 3 days. But if something happens and I get a little behind, it's really producing heavily, I can leave some of them in there. It works out really well, actually.
Anything else you want to mention about raspberries?
Well, I think raspberries are pretty easy to grow, and they're easy to prune and take care of. They produce a beautiful crop and make fabulous jam. You just have to be careful to attention for making sure you mulch, making sure that they don't ever suffer any kind of a drought. Keep them irrigated evenly without too much water. They are sensitive to root rot, and our soil is a heavy clay soil, and we do have a type of Phytophthora in our soil that does infect our raspberries occasionally. And we then, I've had it actually identified at a state lab to make sure. So what we do is we just make sure that we pull those out occasionally. And then I really watch the irrigation, make sure that we're not keeping it too wet or whatever. But we're still going to get a little bit of it because it's in our soil. And you've got a heavy clay soil, and even just normal spring or winter rains or whatever keeps the soil wet. And as soon as that fungus gets active, then you have to be careful not to keep it too wet. And so it's kind of walking a little bit of a fine line there with the irrigation. But otherwise, they're pretty carefree. Once a year fertilization is it, and the pruning doesn't take much time. And I highly recommend raspberries. They're fabulous, and they taste really good.
Well, let's walk over to the other berries and see what's growing. We're at Pam Bone's house here in Sacramento County. Pam Bone is a famous Sacramento County Master Gardener. In fact, she's the original Sacramento County Master Gardener, by the way. And Pam has cultivated a growing passion of hers for over 40 years. Pam loves berries. When we come back, Pam explains how to grow, train, and irrigate boysenberries. You're listening to the Garden Basics 2022's Greatest Hits, Part 2. I'm pretty picky about who I allow to advertise on this podcast. My criteria, though, is pretty simple. It has to be a product I like, a product I use, and a product I would buy again. And you know who checks all those boxes? It's Smart Pots. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Smart Pots are sold around the world, and they're proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots come in a wide array of sizes and colors and can be reused year after year. Some models even have handles, and that makes them a lot easier to move around the yard. Because the fabric breathes, Smart Pots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for hot climates. That breathable fabric has other benefits too. Water drainage issues? Not with Smart Pots. Roots that go round and round choking the root ball like they do in plastic pots? Doesn't happen with Smart Pots. These benefits will help you get a bigger, better plant than what you've gotten in the past with the same size plastic or other hard container. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers as well as select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED. F-R-E-D. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pot's lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. We are at Pam Bone's house here in Sacramento County, where they have developed a yard for over 40 years, and Pam loves berries. Pam, it's almost like Knott's Berry Farm here. You've got boysenberries here.
Yes. I come from Washington State. My husband comes from Oregon State, and you have to grow berries, raspberries, boysenberries, whatever. Boysenberries are just ideal for making pies, and I make a lot of pies. They make a wonderful jam, and of course, they're delicious for fresh eating as well. And they love our Sacramento climate.
So does that mean that in a state like Washington, they wouldn't do well?
No, they do great there, too.
Oh.
They love it there. They do just as fine. So you just have to decide, do you have the sun for them? They just like full sun, and they do really well in that. They are very adaptable, actually.
Describe the trellis that you've designed for them.
Years ago, we had a massive system with the big wooden crossbars on it and the ones that you see commercially and all. And it's a pretty daunting thing, and it takes a lot of time and energy to install, and it's expensive. And one day we had a massive tree fall and literally destroy our entire berry patch here, including the crossbars. And so we decided, you know what, we're going to do this a little easier. And we're going to use these T-bars, these metal T-bars with wires, and it works just beautifully. It holds them nicely. We've got T-bars spaced out so that you've got not too much tension on the wire, or, too much stress on the wires here. And then we've got the 3-wire system so that the berries can be trained in 3 different locations and tied on with little twisty ties. And then we use kind of a barrel method, sort of where you come up from the base of the plant and then you go onto one of the wires and train the branches sometimes as a barrel loop if you've got a long enough cane, and they loop around, gives a little more maximum sun exposure for the plant. But yeah, these T-bars just work really, really well. They stay in the soil nicely, and you can see they turn in just a little on the edges just because some of the tension's late in the season, but you can twist the wire a little bit tighter, and it works great. And it's inexpensive, easy to do, and not so daunting.
For you technically minded at home, the T-bars are spaced about 8 to 10 feet apart, and there's a 3-wire system on here that looks like it begins about 18 inches above the ground, and the next 2 wires are also spaced by another 18 inches. And so the total height of this is maybe 4.5 to 5 feet.
Yes, and then some of the berries later in the season, then they'll stick up a little bit further and they'll lop over just a bit. But otherwise, this contains them pretty nicely, actually. You can see that we do have some canes that are growing past the wires, but for the most part, it works well for us. If you've got a really, really vigorous canes growing, then you might want to make a little bit taller.
And a little bit more support on the ends as well.
Exactly. That's true, too. If they get really heavy and laden down, then the wires then sag and that. And we get a little bit of that. But gosh, it's a really inexpensive, easy way to do it. And if for some reason you had to move it or adjust things or whatever, it's easy to do. This whole thing with the big wooden crossbars and people putting them in concrete and whatever else they do, it's like digging a fence and I don't know, a permanent structure may not be what you needed to have.
How do you care for boysenberries then? What are the watering requirements, the fertilization, and the pruning requirements?
Well, as far as watering goes, they need regular irrigation, at least once a week irrigation. We have a drip irrigation system using the inline emitters in rows down the berries themselves. We have 3 lines on each of the rows, so we encompass most of the root system. And then we want to make sure that we run that drip irrigation as long as water is flowing down into the root system. We want it to go down in as far as we can, which is going to be at least 12 to 18 inches is where most of those roots are contained. So you want to make sure that you run the irrigation long enough. I will say that I find that most people do not run their drip irrigation long enough, and they just dribble out a little bit of water. Then you get a very shallow root system. And what happens if you have a dry spell, you forget to water, something happens or whatever, then the plants really suffer. So watering is really critical. The other thing that we do is we put on a lot of wood chips. We get a lot of arborist wood chips that are delivered to us and put that on. And then we always top dress with compost. We have a lot of compost piles. We have a lot of oak trees and other trees that produce leaves. And plus, of course, I save all my kitchen scraps and that. And that compost then makes a wonderful top dressing. It doesn't completely eliminate fertilization, but it helps to give you a little bit of nutrition as well as keeping the soil moist and cool and helping to mitigate soil fluctuations in temperatures. And then it's going to help with your watering as well. So fertilizing then about once a year. Already did it just a few weeks ago, just as the growth is starting up in usually early March. Then we go in with an all-purpose fertilizer, or in our case, this year and in years past, we often just get an all-purpose lawn fertilizer, high in nitrogen, which these berries need, but it still gives you a little bit of phosphorus and potassium. But nitrogen, people don't realize that you've got to have the growth in order to produce flowers and fruits, and the fact that we're putting on a lot of mulch and a lot of compost on top, and that the soil in our area isn't real deficient in phosphorus and potassium. You don't need very much of it. You're going to get it from your mulch and your compost a little bit anyhow. So the nitrogen's the one thing that is transitory. You put it on and it flows right out with your waters. And you got to be careful not to overwater or you'll lose your nitrogen. So nitrogen's real important that it be put on annually for all fruits, whether they're bushes or vines or fruit trees.
Always a good idea to have your soil tested before you do any planting so you know exactly what your soil needs. There are a couple of inexpensive university-related soil testing sites that'll be glad to take your $20 and send you back a soil test report. One is the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the other is Colorado State University. If you look up either of those universities and put in the words soil test, you'll get the details on how to go about that. And they're fairly complete soil tests, too, so that is a inexpensive option. Of course, you can always soil test for macronutrients and pH yourself. You can find those kits at any garden center or nursery. But yeah, know your soil before you plant anything. Are the boysenberries like raspberries? Once a branch produces, it's done?
Yes, and in fact, in this case, because our raspberries, I was saying earlier, are fall bears or ever bears, people call them, because they produce 2 crops. This produces 1 crop. We get a crop in June, and then that's it. And then those berries, as soon as they start to really dry back and look kind of crispy, you just remove them. Then the new canes are all coming up from the base of the plant, and we let them just sprawl on the ground while the others are dying back. Then we take them out, and at some point, then put the new ones up onto the trellis.
All right. Boysenberries, and what do you do with them? When do you harvest them?
Harvesting is in June in our area. Basically, they're pretty much finished by the 4th of July. We can usually count on the last crop just about then, and they will start producing about the first week of June. And you just come out and pick them. You pick them with your fingers. You don't have to use any kind of pruning equipment or anything like that. You just pluck them off, and they store very nicely in a colander in the refrigerator. And I make a lot of pies and jam with them, and We eat them fresh and just love them. They're great. Boysenberries are one of the most versatile berries and do well in a variety of climates as long as you have. They actually will tolerate the sun even better than raspberries. Full sun. They don't do well in the shade as far as, they'll produce a lot of vine, but who wants that? And then you do have to, one thing with boysenberries, like any blackberry, because they're a type of blackberry, is that they will send up errant blackberries, and you can get the blackberry mess if you're not careful, where the patch gets overgrown. So just go out there and make sure you tidy up the rows occasionally and dig out those ones. Otherwise, we don't find them becoming the jungle at all, unless you're just not keeping up with it.
Are there boysenberry varieties?
Boysenberry is a variety of blackberry. So there are nectar berries, which some people say boysenberries and nectar berries are the same. There are loganberries. There are alala berries. These are all types of berries that were developed from a blackberry. And then there are lots of just blackberries that are not crosses, but have been also genetically grown to produce different varieties of blackberries. So you can just get an ordinary blackberry. These are a larger berry, a little bit softer berry. I like them because I think they're better for pies and that. We did grow regular blackberries as well, but found they weren't to my satisfaction for baking with them and making jam. So we took them out and put in more boysenberries.
How daunting are the thorns on these?
You know, back in the day when we first put these in, the thornless berries didn't produce very well. They were not very good varieties. Now, I understand from a lot of growers and from the master gardeners that grow these at our Fair Oaks Horticulture Center that a lot of the thornless varieties are excellent now and do produce well. So we put in thorny varieties, and they're not that bad. I will say when we're tying them up, oftentimes you have to put tape or something on your fingers to prevent yourself from just getting little prickles into your fingers, but they're not that bad. And they just produce so well.
It is a little hard to be tying branches up to wires when you're wearing thick goat gloves.
You can't do that. That's the problem. And so doing something, and actually what works actually pretty well now, and I found that I like these, is just the little thin latex gloves you use for just clean up around the house and that. They actually work pretty well for being able to tie with those. And then you can replace them and they're cheap.
There you go. That's a good quick tip. We are in the boysenberry patch at Pam Bone's house. It looks to be very delicious. He said punnily. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you very much, Fred. I enjoy sharing my crop with you.
If after listening to our discussion about raspberries and boysenberries, you're still uncertain how to trellis these fruits, we have links in today's show notes that offer more information as well as diagrams and pictures. The information about trellising berries is from 3 different universities, including the University of California, Pennsylvania State, and Cornell. Again, you can find these links in today's show notes. The weather may not be perfect for outdoor gardening right now, but it's perfect for planning your 2023 garden. Now's the time to plan the what and the where of what you want to plant for the future. And to help you along, it pays to visit your favorite independently owned nursery on a regular basis throughout the fall and winter just to see what's new. And coming soon to that nursery near you is Dave Wilson Nursery's excellent lineup of farmers market favorites, great tasting, healthy fruit and nut varieties. They'll already be potted up and ready to be planted. And we're also talking about a great selection of antioxidant-rich fruits, such as blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, goji berries, grapes, kiwi, mulberries, gooseberries, figs, and pomegranates. Wholesale grower Dave Wilson Nursery has probably the best lineup of great tasting fruit and nut trees of any grower in the United States. Find out more at their website, davewilson.com. And while you're there, check out all the videos they have on how to plant and grow all their delicious varieties of fruit and nut trees. Plus, at davewilson.com, you can find the nursery nearest you that carries Dave Wilson's plants. Your harvest to better health begins at davewilson.com. You've heard of no-till gardening. How about no-dig gardening or creating a lasagna garden? Emily Murphy, author of the book Grow Now, will explain. You're listening to the Garden Basics Podcast, Greatest Hits of 2022, Part 2. In a couple of recent podcast episodes, we talked with Emily Murphy. She's the author of the book Grow Now. Among the topics we covered included regenerative gardening and knowing your nature quotient, how better to understand the rhythms of your plants and how they grow, and everything that interacts with the life of your plants, and that includes your soil. Because, as we're fond of saying here, a healthy soil leads to healthier plants. And one technique to improve the health of your soil is to forego rototilling, which does more damage than good to the underground biology of your soil. It's a technique called no-till, a practice that has taken hold in the world of agriculture, especially among producers of organic crops. But the practice of no-till isn't just for your bare ground. In this chat with Emily Murphy, she explains how this technique, keeping your soil undisturbed as much as possible, can be applied to your raised beds and container plants. She calls it no-dig. And she talks about a way to build your soil without having to purchase bags or yards of potting mix. It's called lasagna gardening.
And the other way to tackle no dig is not just by growing in the ground, but it's also to use no dig techniques in raised beds and containers. The idea there is that instead of sourcing soil, say for a raised bed, a larger bed, the typical rule of thumb is to use 50-50 compost to topsoil. That's kind of the general rule of thumb for filling raised beds. That's fine. Oftentimes, soil is sourced from places that have been excavated for building sites and whatnot, so it's already getting moved. But when you think about it, soil does have to come from somewhere, and it's disturbing soil somewhere else where it's then, when it's excavated, releases carbon to the atmosphere, disturbs that soil ecosystem, which is valuable to wherever that soil came from. Instead of moving soil from one place to another, also takes a lot of fossil fuels, right, to move a heavy load of soil. Instead, we can compost in place and use lasagna gardening or hugelkultur, which is a German word for layering organic matter in place, sort of in situ, and planting in that. And I show how to do that and Grow Now. It's a really simple technique. It's the same technique I use to fill my raised beds. If anyone follows me on social media, you'll see the garden that I built a year ago this month, and I filled them with this lasagna gardening technique. And it's composting. Sticks and twigs on the bottom. So you have your layer of browns, layer of greens, layer of browns. And I save the fine compost for the top. I did have to bring in compost because it was a new garden, and I didn't have time to make any, but I sourced it locally. I'm really lucky. I have West Marin compost is not far from here. It's about a mile away. I saved that fine compost for the soil surface and planted in it. And 3 months later, I had this incredible start of summer garden, and you can plant intensively. And it's so simple and so empowering. The technique, you're right. Okay, you don't want to wag your finger at someone and say, don't do that. I agree. But at the same time, wow, what a gift to be given to these techniques. Make it so easy and immediately get you off on the right foot towards success.
In those raised beds, do you even have to fertilize the plants?
I didn't. I didn't. And the only thing I do is I add, this last year I added compost to a few places. Otherwise, I put in a cover crop of fava beans where I wasn't growing greens. I will add a layer of compost with manures in it this spring. And I'm in the process of doing that. I'm a little behind because of the release of Grow Now. Grow Now came out February 1st. And as you can imagine, it's been a wild ride with the bookmaking, and with anything in your garden, you have to prioritize. You don't have time for everything. And I've decided to focus on, since I have the veggie garden in place, I decided to put most of my attention towards the rewilding project out front, knowing that I can get to the veggie garden with time because I'm in California and the growing season's so long.
Exactly. Yes, indeed. Well, the benefits of just applying the mulch like you do, as it breaks down, it feeds the soil. And if it's one thing I say a lot on this podcast, you're not feeding plants, you're feeding the soil, which in turn will feed the plants. And
absolutely. That's exactly what I say as well. And that's what I say in Grow Now. You're really feeding the soil ecosystem. What you'll read in Grow Now, part of the regenerative process, is not just supporting biodiversity, but really beginning this decadal process of pulling carbon from the atmosphere underground. One of the studies I found so interesting when I started writing Grow Now was the study out of UC Davis. It was a 20-year study looking at the reality of sequestering carbon underground. Can we really do it? Does it really work? Do regenerative practices work to sequester carbon and sequester carbon at depth and sequester stable carbon? And they found over this 20-year study, yes, it does. And they found, yes, keeping living roots in the ground, which is a tenet of regenerative growing as well, with the use of cover crops is vitally important. And that supports biodiversity. It keeps living roots in the ground. And those roots feed the soil as well through the root exudates, which is a big term, but it's described in Grow Now. But more importantly, it was the application of compost, of feeding the soil compost, that really drove this carbon sequestration process. And what the writers of the research said was they said that it could even be a half an inch to an inch of compost over a landscape that has the power to sequester carbon. And when we approach our landscapes then with this layer of compost and a no-dig approach, we're able to maintain those carbon stores underground in a stable fashion for many, many years. Now, it can take time. It's, again, a decadal process, but it's possible. And the benefits are immediate because when we feed the soil, we're feeding the biodiversity in the soil and the soil ecology, which then feeds our plants, helps us grow gardens much easier. The soil is doing much of the work for us, keeping our plants resilient, and feeds the ecology above the ground in many ways because there's this feed forward loop.
So I would imagine, since you talked about lasagna gardening, that this compost layer goes on top of your soil, and then you're covering that with some sort of mulch in order to keep, say, flying weed seeds from germinating in that very fine compost.
Absolutely. And the type of mulch you use depends upon what you plan to grow. So we were talking about rules of thumb earlier. The typical rule of thumb with the mulch you choose is based upon what it is you're growing. So if you're growing trees and shrubs, particularly native trees and shrubs, the idea is to mulch with materials that are similar to mulch that's made up of materials that are similar to the plants you're growing. And so it can be more woody debris, leaves as the primary source of compost making or mulch making. But with a veggie garden, you want to use a compost for a veggie garden, when you're prepping for a veggie garden, you want to use a compost that is more in keeping with the plants you're going to grow again. So a compost that's been made out of kitchen scraps, for instance, or kitchen scraps and leaves and other organic materials, a compost that has been fed kitchen scraps. And I think that's a pretty easy parallel to follow when you're considering, well, which type of mulch should I use? And that's one place to start. And of course, whatever's local is also a really good place to start.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
If you can source it in your own garden or your neighbor's garden, if your neighbor has leaves, wonderful. Use those leaves.
Which is why I use the oak leaves that fall every November and December in my neighborhood and grind them up either with my mower or with a string trimmer, and place those on top of my raised beds for the winter. But before I put those leaves down, I put down a layer of worm castings directly on top of the soil and then top that with the oak leaf mulch that's been ground up. And you talk about in your book, too, in the book Grow Now, you talk about vermicomposting, basically making that compost you're talking about via the worms with a worm bin, and also great instructions on even starting a compost pile as well. Now, you mentioned earlier that people can follow you on social media. We need to know where.
Yeah. People can find me, Emily Murphy, at Pass the Pistil, and that's PISTIL as in part of a flower. That's the name of my website, passthepistil.com. And I'm primarily on Twitter and Instagram and sometimes on Facebook. I'm on Facebook too. I do have some Pinterest boards, but I spend most of my time on Instagram and Twitter talking about all of these topics of growing and the power of growing and the benefits of growing, not just for our gardens, but for ourselves and for growing resilient communities and eventually then a resilient planet and a place for ourselves and our families and our children's children to enjoy and appreciate.
And we should point out that the pistil you refer to, the pistil, is the female part of the flower.
That's right. That's right. That was the play on words. My husband and I, years ago, when I started my blog, that's how I started. I thought, okay, I want to write a book one day. And to write a book, I have to start writing. And I started my blog for that reason, to give myself a challenge or the goal of writing something every week so I could improve as a writer. We were trying to think of, okay, if I were to have a blog, what would I name my blog? And it went back to, and I talk about this in my bio in my website, it went back to something my mom would say that I can't say on your podcast. It was bleep or get off the pot.
Yeah.
And it was her way of saying, if you're going to do something, just do it, just get to it. And I had been thinking about really wanting to return to growing. I'd studied ethnobotany, botany, as I mentioned earlier, but I spent a number of years after college teaching, and I was a classroom teacher, and I reached a point where I really missed working with plants more directly. I loved being a teacher. I learned so much from it. I think my years as a classroom teacher, I taught everything from 8th grade math and science to multi-age classrooms. But I think that those years as a teacher really helped me take so many ideas and distill them into one book. And Grow Now is so full of a wide range of ideas, and not just the how to, but the why to. And I think that does come from my background. But there was a time when I realized it wasn't enough and I'd had to get back to the plant world. And that's when I started my blog and I studied garden design. I went to the California School of Garden Design in the foothills near Auburn, California, and learned so much there. And that was really my launch point. But Pass the Pistil was my way of saying, okay, get to it. Get to it now. If you're going to do it, you really want to do it, just do it and start somewhere. And this is how it evolved. Grow what you love and pass it on. So grow what you love and pass the pistil, pass the flower and all that you grow, and share it with others.
Emily Murphy, the author of the book Grow Now, has been with us. We've covered a lot of topics, and there you can find more information in her latest book, Grow Now, available wherever you find your books. Emily, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us.
Yeah, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.
In this Friday's Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, we cover a topic as current as the recent weather. Rain, lots of rain, and your garden. We have a list of do's and don'ts for thwarting pests that become more active with the rain, and also caring for your waterlogged garden soil. And in the podcast portion of the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, we get tips from a noted landscape designer on how to drain excess water away from your home and garden. For current newsletter subscribers, look for the Too Much Rain newsletter in your email. It's probably waiting for you now. Or you can start a subscription. By the way, it's free. Find the link in today's show notes or sign up at the newsletter link at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. I hope you enjoyed today's second episode of 4 in a row, the top 10 most listened to segments of the Garden Basics podcast with Farmer Fred that aired during 2022. Next Friday, we'll have information in part 3 on how to start your very first garden, which includes tips for longtime gardeners too, just in case you move and you have to start over with a garden, because we'll have tips that you may never have even considered when establishing a garden. Also, we'll have information on how to reuse old potting soil. And then in the fourth and final part of our 2022 Greatest Hits, this will be in 2 weeks, we feature myself and America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, with tips for getting ready for your spring garden. It was recorded in front of a live garden club audience. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays. Plus, the newsletter podcast that comes with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter continues, and that will also be released on Fridays. Both are free, and they're brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can also sign up for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. That's gardenbasics.net, or you can use the links in today's show notes. And thank you so much for listening.